Hi, my name is Søren. Welcome to the third video about Morini ignition, where I will talk about the most complicated parts of the ignition system. The ignition boxes and the pickup. These two work in harmony, so you can't really look at one without the other. As I promised in the first video, I won't go into extreme details, but because of the more complex nature of these parts, I feel the urge to throw some theoretical stuff in, so bear with me or skip to the summary. With petrol engines and of course a lot of other engine types, you take advantage of a gas expanding while burning. This is of course what pushes the piston down, and you want this expansion to happen at the correct moment, so you get the most force out of the expansion. And if all things are equal, the expansion happens at a certain rate, which is a constant. With increasing engine revs, you have increasing piston speeds. And to synchronize this constant, the expansion of the gas, with the increasing piston speeds, you actually need to set fire to the gas mixture sooner, so you will hit the piston at the correct moment. This advance in timing used to be regulated with some sort of mechanical device, or even manually. These days everything is of course electronic, and actually the Morini 3.5 was the first production bike to have an electronic ignition with electronic regulated advance. To have an idea about how these two in harmony deal with the task of making this advance, I will again take advantage of Markus Heilig. If you look at his homepage under Symptom Original, you'll find the diagrams of the various ignition types, and this one is the early type. In fact, it's largely the character of the output signal from the pickup coils that is responsible for when the ignition boxes are triggered. But for reading and interpreting this signal, the components of the pickup and the ignition boxes are of course responsible. In the diagram you will see the ignition boxes on the left and the round pickup on the right. You see that the pickup has some components built into it, 2 diodes and 2 resistors, and these along with the components of the ignition boxes are responsible for dealing with the signal from the pickup coils. But here it gets a bit tricky, because you might know that there are several generations and variations of the pickups and the ignition boxes. So we better have a look at those. Here we have the 3 types of pickups that we used, and a small selection of ignition boxes. I can't show you all the types because I simply haven't got them. But these are the early type and these are the later type. But I'll return to the ignition boxes. First we'll look at the pickups. This is the earliest type. It has a cast type housing for the magnet. And the next generation had a pressed plate type rotor. There's also another difference, the difference in gap size for the magnets. And they have to go with the correct pickup. The early type pickup had a wider anchor, and you may see it here. And they have to go to the correct pickup. The last generation, the absolute last one of them, had this stabilizing bearing. Not the first type or the first Morinis that came with the black pickup has this bearing. But the rotor is the same as for the second generation, so these can be interchanged. Beside these very obvious differences, there's also an internal difference between the early red ones and the black ones. So we better look at the diagram again. This time we'll look at this diagram. Here we have a combination of 2 generations. On the upper half of the page we have the early pickup, the red one, and the early ignition boxes. Below we have the black pickup and the later ignition boxes. And if we scrutinize the diagram, you will clearly see that the black pickup doesn't have any components built into it other than of course the essential coils. But we will also find that the essential difference between the two generations is the placement of the diode. Whereas it's placed in the pickup in the early generation, it is for the later generation placed in the ignition boxes. So you simply can't interchange the parts. You can't take a red pickup, which has a diode built into it, and combine it with an ignition box that also has a diode built into it. But you can, however, go the other way around. You can take a later type pickup, the black one, with no diode, and combine it with an early type ignition box that also has no diode built into it. You simply introduce this diode yourself. You put it in series with the red wire and then connect it to the ignition box. And there's also another difference. The early type has an output signal for the electronic rev counter. It's marked GIRI. If you want to use the later type with an electronic rev counter, there is a way, and I'll show you that later. The difference between these two are of course that this one is for the 3.5 and this is for the 500. And if the stickers, the green and the red one, are missing, there's also a number. It's a 6-digit number and the first 4 are the same, so you have to look out for the last 2. And I'll show you a list here on the right, which number goes to which box. The difference between the 500 and 3.5 is the advance curve. So ideally you should use the correct ignition box for your engine. I've heard some reports on people swapping between 3.5 and 500 boxes, and the general notion is that 3.5 will run as well with the 500 ignition boxes. Some say even better. The other way round shouldn't be that good an idea. I myself have been running my Sleeping Beauty with the 500 boxes, simply because it came with it, and I wasn't aware about it until much later. And when I changed for 3.5 boxes, I didn't really notice any difference. But it may have something to do with me having a throttle that is an on-off switch. So I didn't really notice any difference in the advance curve. An explanation you might find in La Strega, the 46th edition. Here you will find a diagram that shows the advance curves of 2 generations of pickups and ignition boxes. It's the early 500, the early 3.5, later 3.5 and later 500. So you see, unless you have the later 500 ignition setup, you probably won't notice any difference if you go from one to another. If you make any experiments swapping 3.5, 500 boxes, at least make sure you use the same type for both cylinders. Enough theory. Let's look at the problems you might have with the parts. Again, I'm going to be repetitive and say that heat and vibrations are causes for faults. If we begin with the pickups, the early type, the red ones, are more prone to have defects than the later type, the black ones. They have these components built into them, and they produce some heat that may cause damage to the coils and the components themselves. And the heat may cause the housing to crack, so you'll have moisture coming in. The black ones are more reliable, and they're probably also made a little bit better. I can't remember that I've heard of any self-induced problems coming from the pickup themselves or the black ones. What I've heard of and seen, and that also applies for the red ones, are mechanics-induced problems. Things like a pickup that isn't centered correctly to the rotor, so you have the rotor scraping at the pickup. And this cup-shaped washer, it has to go on top of the rotor. I have one here that I've removed from a K2. The previous owner had put a standard flat washer and some silicone underneath. The nut was tightened correctly, but the rotor was loose on the camshaft, and it caused the catch here to come loose from the housing. You can see I can wiggle it a bit. And finally the magnet cracked. It was very difficult to figure out what the problem was. Not until the magnet cracked it was obvious. So use this cup-shaped washer. The screws that go to hold the pickup, don't over tighten them, and use a fairly large washer. Otherwise, if you tighten it too much, you will have indentations in the housing, so you won't be able to adjust the timing. If you have this bearing, it's often discussed if it's of any good at all. It was introduced, I think, to stabilize the rotor because of the mechanical rev counter. The drive for the rev counter may have caused some instabilities to the rotor. So, if you mount it again, make sure it's seated correctly, and make sure it's centered correctly. If anything is off here, you can really make damage to this rotor or the pickup, because you will have constant pressure in a wrong direction. A problem I think only applies for the early types is that some of them have the problem where the pickups aren't positioned correctly to each other. So you can choose between one cylinder being on time and the other one a bit off, or the compromise on both of them a bit off. There's nothing you can do about it other than getting another pickup. The ignition boxes are relatively reliable, but of course heat and vibrations will cause damage to the electronics inside. So eventually they will wear out. You sometimes have crackings in the housings, you will get moisture in. So if you ride in a very wet environment and you have any symptoms, it's probably one of the boxes that is failing. They usually simply stop functioning. You can of course also have a broken wire, and that also applies to the pickups, of course. You should be aware of a couple of things. Of course, you should make sure that the connectors are clean and they have good surface contact. And you should never put 12 volts directly to the green wire. This will kill the boxes. So make sure you don't have any accidents happening. Other than that, yeah, they wear out. Let me try at least to explain some of the symptoms you might have with these parts. There are various symptoms, and some of them resemble the symptoms you have with the primary coil, the flywheel, and the carburetors. But usually you can tell them apart. For the aforementioned, you will usually have a longer period where things slowly get worse over time, and the problem will be persistent. For these parts, it's usually a rapid decline, and you may have things that come and go. If you look at the pickups, the most common symptom you will have when the engine is warm. You will have sputtering from the engine, one cylinder dying, in rare cases both cylinders dying. And unlike with the flywheel, it isn't necessarily linked to the starting procedures. You may have it dying on you, and a few seconds later you will be able to restart the engine. So inconsequent and strange behavior must be the key words for these parts, and especially the pickup. And not so much the ignition boxes. They rarely give any warning. They simply stop functioning, or is a very rapid decline. For both parts, it's usually only on one cylinder you have the problems. Of course you can have it on both cylinders with the pickup. But for the ignition boxes, you will rarely have the case where both of them die on you at the same time, unless you put 12 volts directly to the green wire. So usually only one cylinder. You may also have these strange overnight problems where you ride your Morini with no problems, park it in the garage at night, and the next morning when it has cooled down, you have the problems. This can be a symptom of one of these parts failing. To make any definite diagnosis on these parts, it's of course implied that you have ruled out any other source of faults. But if you have the problem where you have no spark at all on both cylinders, it's most likely the pickup that's causing the problem. As I said, the ignition boxes rarely die at the same time. If you have a spark on only one cylinder, you can interchange the two ignition boxes, of course move the cables and wires. If the problem moves from one cylinder to the other, it's most likely the ignition box that's causing the problem. And if it stays, it's most likely the pickup that's causing the problem. There's no way with simple means that you can measure the pickup. The ignition boxes you can test, and I will refer to Paul Compton. He has made some videos about a simple way to test the ignition boxes. But be aware it has to do with 12 volts and the green wire. But he knows what he's doing, so if you follow his instructions, you will have no problems. If you need a new pickup, you'll probably have a hard time finding a used one. The red ones are becoming scarce because they are prone to have these defects. And the Morinisti that have a black one in their stash don't want to sell them. But you can get replicas, and I think Wolfgang Tritsch and North Leicester Motorcycles both have a replica. But I would like to point out the one from Markus Heilig. He makes a very nicely built one that has a lot of improvements compared to the old ones. And especially that you can adjust the two pickups independently. You can also get them as a red version and a black version, so you will have no problems matching them with the ignition boxes you have. Replacement for the ignition boxes used to be a bit of a problem, or at least to my knowledge. You would either go for a used one in working order, or you would buy a very expensive aftermarket original Morini box. But you might have noticed the whole way through this video, there has been in the background lying this blue bastard. This one goes into the Vespa ET3 and a lot of other Piaggio's engines. It's built almost exactly like the early type for the Morini. It has a big ignition coil, so you get a stronger spark, but the advance curve is the same. So if you disregard these differences between the 3.5 and the 500, it can replace all of the ignition boxes. It doesn't have the diode built into it, so it's fairly plug and play with the red pickup. For the black one, you would use a diode between the cable and the box, and I'll show you that later. It also doesn't have an output signal for the electronic rev counter, but there's also a solution for that, and I'll also show you that later. For the Piaggios, the original box is from DUCATI Elettronica. And if you want to make sure that you get the correct one, you should look out for a number stamped in the housing. There are a lot of these ignition boxes out there that are for different models, and they all look the same. You can even get lucky and get one in black for the Morini. But if you want to look for the correct one, you have to look for this DUCATI number. It's not stamped in this one because it's a Chinese knockoff. It's from Mitsubishi. And they are a lot cheaper than the Ducatis. Not that the Ducatis are expensive, but I think these are half price. I paid 15 or 16 euros for this one. So look out for the number if you want to make sure. Or I simply look for boxes for the ET3 and the other models. So it is these days fairly easy to get an ignition box. As promised, I will show you how to connect the electronic rev counter to these boxes, and I'll also show you how to mount the diode for the red wire. I mentioned earlier that there's no output signal from these boxes as there is with the early type. So you need some sort of electronic circuit that will give the rev counter the correct signal. I know of two possible solutions, a ready-made and one where you make the circuit yourself. Wolfgang Tritsch has a ready-made solution. You simply connect the wires and you're up and running. I made one myself, and I know of two diagrams you can use. The one that comes up on the screen, that's the one I've chosen, simply because I had the components readily available. But there's also one in La Strega. It's a bit different, but does the same job. You simply connect it to the power feed that also feeds the electronic rev counter, ground of course. This is the output signal that goes to the rev counter, and the red one here is connected to either of the two red wires that comes from the pickup, and then is mounted to the or connected to the ignition boxes. I've chosen a connector like this one so you can connect them together. So if you have some experience with the soldering iron, it's a fairly easy job to make one like this. If you're going to connect the black pickup with an ignition box without a diode, you need to mount a diode between, as I've mentioned earlier. There are possibly more solutions, but I will show you the two that I have used. Throughout this video I think I've been saying one diode, the diode, or a diode. But you of course need two diodes, one for each cylinder. A diode, or this kind of diode, is simply said blocking one direction. So you will only have the power or the signal going in one direction, and it will be blocked the other way. Almost all diodes have a ring marking in one end of the diode, and that's the cathode or the blocking end, and this is the anode where it lets the power through. So you need to mount them the right way round. You want the signal going from the pickup to the ignition boxes. So the ring must have must be directed towards the boxes. And this is my current solution for my Sleeping Beauty. It's simply two connectors where I've soldered the diode in between, and then with some shrink tubing to make it waterproof. The other solution is to simply solder the diodes directly in the wire. As you see, this pickup, the previous owner had done some sort of modification, and I'm simply going to cut out this this connector and solder the diode directly in the wire. As you can see, I've already done one, and I'm doing one at a time to make sure that this marking is placed correctly, so I don't have any mix-ups. And remember to place the cathode and the anode in the correct direction. The blocking end, the cathode, goes towards the ignition boxes, and the anode goes to the pickup. And that's all there is to it. You will most likely have to readjust the ignition timing if you do any sort of modification or exchange of parts, so always do that afterwards. And a small last tip, because we often hear about people that can't figure out which way the rotor goes. When the first cylinder, the front cylinder, is set to compression stroke, and you have the marking on the flywheel at top dead center, it should be pointing at around 4 o'clock. But it's all stated in the manual, so get that one and do yourself the favor and actually read it. If you followed me this far without falling asleep, I salute you. If you skip to the summary, I do understand. To summarize, the symptoms are strange behavior or inconsequent behavior that may resemble the symptoms you have with the primary core, the flywheel, or the carburetors. But you will have a rapid decline and erratic behavior. You may have these overnight problems where things all of a sudden appear. For the pickup, you will usually have the symptoms with a very warm engine, and the boxes rarely give any symptom or warnings, but you may have some early signs in wet weather. It's usually only on one cylinder you have the problems, in rare cases if it's a pickup, on both cylinders. For fault finding, do yourself a favor and rule out any other source of problems. It will make it much more easy to establish a correct diagnosis. If you have the problem on only one cylinder, you can interchange the two ignition boxes. And if the problem moves from one cylinder to the other, it's most likely the boxes that, or one of the boxes that's causing the problems. And if it stays the same cylinder, it's most likely the pickup. There's no way you can, or not with simple means, can measure the pickup. But if you can borrow a working one, you can of course establish a diagnosis that way. The boxes you can test using Paul Compton's method. Don't over tighten the screws that hold the pickup, and make sure it's centered correctly to the rotor. And especially if you have the bearing, make sure it's seated and centered correctly. And use the cup-shaped washer. It's there for a reason. Never put 12 volts directly to the green wire. It will kill your boxes. For parts, the pickups you can get aftermarkets from Northwest Motorcycles and Wolfgang Tritsch. But I would recommend you look at Markus Heilich's very beautifully made one. The ignition boxes you can also get aftermarket ones, but again I would advise you to buy these Vespa ET3 boxes. They're very inexpensive. And if you want to be sure that you get the correct one, look out for the DUCATI number 32 39 81 12. Between the pickup and each of the two ignition boxes, there should be one and only one diode. If it's built in the pickup like it is with the red one, you can combine it with the early type of boxes, the Vespa boxes, but not with the later type boxes. The black pickup you can combine with all ignition boxes, but for the Vespa and the early type boxes, you would put a diode between the red wires and the boxes. The rev counter, if you want to use an electronic rev counter with a box that doesn't have the output signal, you can buy a circuit from Wolfgang Tritsch that will give you the correct signal. Or you can make the circuit yourself. Read the manual, and thanks for watching.